The Steam House by Jules Verne. Translated by Agnes D. Kingston. Chapter 16. Roving Flame. For a whole month, from the 12th of March to the 12th of April, Nana Sahib remained concealed in Nepal. He wished to give the English authorities time either to make some mistake by thinking he was dead, and so give up the search, or to go on a false scent in quite another direction. The two brothers did not go out in the daytime themselves, but their faithful followers went forth throughout the valley, visiting the villages and hamlets, announcing in ambiguous words the approaching apparition of a great multi, half god, half man, and thus preparing their minds for a national rising. When night fell, Nana Sahib and Balao Rao ventured to quit their retreat. Following the banks of the Nerbudda, they went from village to village, from pall to pall, awaiting the time when, with some security, they might attempt the domains of the Rajas under British rule. Nana Sahib knew, besides, that there were many semi-independent tribes who were impatient of the foreign yoke and would rally round him at his summons. But in the first instance he must only deal with the savage populations of Gondwana. These barbarous Bhils, nomad Khons, and Goons, as little civilized as the natives of the Pacific Isles, the Nana found all ready to rise and follow where he would. Although he prudently only made himself known to 2 or 3 powerful chiefs, that was sufficient to prove to him that his name alone would attract millions of natives from the central plateau of Hindustan. When the two brothers met again in their pall, they compared notes of all that they had seen, heard, and done. Their companions then joined them, bringing from all parts word that the spirit of revolt was blowing like a tempest through the Nerbudda Valley. The Goons only longed to be allowed to yell the Kisri, or war cry of the hillmen, and hurl themselves like a cataract on the military cantonments of the Residency. The time for that had not yet come. It was in truth not enough that in the province lying between the Satpuras and the Vindhyas alone the spirit of revolt should be smouldering. That the fire might gradually gain on the country, it was necessary to carry the combustible elements into the neighboring states, which were more directly under English authority. The whole of the vast kingdom of Sindhia, as well as the states of Bhopal, Malwa, and Bundelkund, were to be made to resemble a huge bonfire, ready and prepared for lighting. But Nana Sahib, wisely enough, did not intend to delegate to others the task of visiting his partisans in the insurrection of 1857. Those natives who remained faithful to his cause and never had believed in his death were constantly expecting his reappearance. A month after his arrival in the Pall of Tandit, the Nana began to consider he might act in safety. He thought that by this time the story of his having been seen in the province would be contradicted. Trusty spies kept him informed as to all that the governor of the Bombay Presidency had done to effect his capture. He knew that at first the authorities had instituted a most active search, but without result. The fisherman of Aurungabad, once the Nana's prisoner, had fallen by his dagger, and no one had suspected that the fugitive fakir was the Nabab Dandu Pant, on whose head a price had been set. In a week the reports grew fewer. The aspirants to the prize of £2,000 lost hope, and the name of Nana Sahib began to be forgotten. Without much fear of being recognized, the Nabab now began his insurrectionary campaign. Now in the costume of a Parsi, and now in that of a humble Ryot, one day alone, and another accompanied by his brother, he went long distances from the Pall of Tandit, northwards, to the other side of the Nerbudda, and even beyond the Vindhyas. If a spy had followed him in his wanderings, he would, soon after the 12th of April, have found him at Indore. There Nana Sahib, whilst preserving the strictest incognito, put himself in communication with the extensive rural population employed in the culture of poppy fields. These were Rihillas, Micranis, Valayalis, eager, courageous, and fanatical, chiefly sepoy deserters, concealed by the dress of native peasants. Nana Sahib, on the 19th of April, passing through a magnificent valley in which dates and mango trees grew in profusion, arrived at Suari. Here rise numerous curious constructions of very great antiquity. They are called topes, and resemble tumuli, crowned with hemispheric domes, the principal group being that of Saldara, at the north of the valley. From these funeral monuments, these dwellings of the dead, the altars of which, dedicated to Buddhist rites, are shaded by stone parasols, issued, at the voice of Nana Sahib, hundreds of fugitives. Buried in these ruins to escape the retaliations of the English, one word was sufficient to make them understand what the Nabob expected of them. When the hour came, a signal would be enough to excite them to throw themselves en masse on the invaders. On the 24th of April, the Nana reached Bilsa, the chief town of an important district of Malwa, and in the ruins of that ancient place he collected men ripe for revolt, to whom he gave the news. On the 27th he entered Rajgor, and on the 30th the old city of Saugor, not far from the spot where General Sir Hugh Rose fought a bloody battle with the insurgents, and with the hill of Mondanpur gained the key of the defiles of the Vindhyas. There the Nabob was joined by his brother and Kalagnani, and the two then made themselves known to the chiefs of the principal tribes in which they were sure. In these councils the preliminaries of a general insurrection were discussed and agreed upon. Whilst Nana Sahib and Balao Rao were pursuing their operations in these parts, their allies were no less busy on the northern side of the Vindhyas. Before returning to the Nirbuda Valley, the two brothers wished to visit Pune. They ventured up the Khin, under the shade of giant teaks and colossal bamboos. Here they enrolled many wild fellows from among the miserable people who work for the Rajah in the valuable diamond mines of the territory. This Rajah, says Monsieur Rousselet, understanding the position which English protection gives to the princes of Bundelkund, prefers the role of a rich landholder to that of an insignificant prince. A rich landholder indeed! The region he possesses extends for 20 miles north of Pune, and the working of his mines, the products of which are most esteemed in the markets of Benares and Allahabad, employs a large number of Hindus. They are very hardly treated, condemned to the severest labor, and running a great chance of being decapitated as soon as their work is no longer required. So it is not to be wondered at that the Nana found many amongst them ready to fight for the independence of their country. Leaving this place, the brothers came southwards again, intending to return to the Pall of Tandit. However, before provoking the southern rising, which should coincide with that of the north, they determined to stop at Bhopal. This is an important Mussulman town, and the capital of Islamism in India. Its Begum remained faithful to the English during the time of the rebellion. Nana Sahib and Balao Rao, accompanied by a dozen goons, arrived at Bhopal on the 24th of May, the last day of the Moharram festival, instituted to celebrate the revival of the Mussulman army. Both had assumed the dress of joguais, religious mendicants armed with long daggers with rounded blades, which they dig into their bodies in a fanatical manner, though without doing any great harm. Being unrecognizable in this disguise, the two brothers followed the procession through the streets of the town, in the midst of numerous elephants, bearing on their backs tadzias, or little temples, 20 feet high. They mingled with the Mussulmen, who were richly clothed in gold-embroidered tunics and muslin turbans. They joined with the musicians, soldiers, dancing girls, young men disguised as women, a strange agglomeration which gave to the ceremony quite the look of a carnival. In this mob of natives were many of their friends, with whom the conspirators could easily manage to exchange a Masonic sign well known to the rebels of 1857. When evening came, the crowd surged towards the lake which bathes the eastern suburb of the town. There, in the midst of deafening cries, reports of firearms, popping of crackers, and by the light of innumerable torches, the fanatics seized the tadzias and cast them into the waters of the lake. The Muharram festival was ended. Just then, Nana Sahib felt a touch on his shoulder. He turned and saw a Bengali standing beside him. The Nana recognized in this man one of his former followers. He gave him a questioning look. The Bengali thereupon murmured the following words, all of which were heard by the Nana without his betraying emotion by a single word or look. "Colonel Munro has left Calcutta." "Where is he?" "He was at Benares yesterday." "Where is he going?" "To the Nepalese frontier." "With what object?" "To stay there a few months." "And then?" "Return to Bombay." A whistle was heard. At the signal, a native glided through the crowd and stood before them. It was Kalanani. "Go this instant," said the Nabob. "Join Munro on his way to the north. Attach yourself to him. Render him some service and risk your life if necessary. Never leave him until he is beyond the Vindhyas in the Nerbudda Valley. Then, and then only, come and give me notice of his presence." Kalanani signed an affirmative and disappeared. An order from the Nabob was enough. In 10 minutes he had left Bhopal. At that moment Balau Rao approached his brother. "It is time to set out," he said. "Yes," replied the Nana, "and before daybreak we must be at the Pal of Tandit." "Forward, then." Followed by their goons, the two men skirted the northern side of the lake until they reached an isolated farm, where horses awaited them and their escort. They were swift animals, fed upon spiced food, and capable of doing 50 miles in a single night. By 8 o'clock they were galloping along the road from Bhopal to the Vindhyas. The Nana prudently wished his return to the Pal to pass unnoticed, so in order to reach their destination before daybreak, they pushed on at their utmost speed. The brothers barely exchanged a word, but their minds were occupied with the same thoughts. During their excursion they had gathered more than hope, the absolute certainty that numberless followers would rally around them. The center of India was entirely in their hands. The military cantonments scattered over this vast territory could not resist the first assault of the insurgents. Their annihilation would leave the way open for the revolt, which, spreading from coast to coast, would call up a wall of determined natives, against which the English army would dash themselves in vain. The Nana's thoughts were divided between this and the fortunate chance which would soon put Munro into his power. The colonel had at last quitted Calcutta, where he was so difficult to get at. Henceforth, none of his movements would be unknown to the Nabob. Without his suspecting it, the hand of Kalagnani would guide him into the wild country of the Vindhyas, and once there, none could protect him from the punishment Nana Sahib's hate reserved for him. Balau Rao knew nothing of what had passed between the Bengali and his brother. It was not until they were approaching the Pal, when stopping to breathe their horses for an instant, that Nana Sahib mentioned the subject. "Munro has left Calcutta and is going to Bombay." "The road to Bombay," exclaimed Balau Rao, "leads to the shores of the Indian Ocean." "The road to Bombay, this time," returned the Nana, "will end in the Vindhyas." This reply was significant. The horses set off again at a gallop through the thick forest which covered the borders of the Nerbudda Valley. It was 5 in the morning, and day was dawning as Nana Sahib, Balau Rao, and their companions drew rein at the foot of the Nazur torrent. The party here dismounted and left their horses in charge of a couple of goons, with orders to take them to the nearest village. The rest then followed the brothers, who were already ascending the torrent. All was still. The noise of day had not yet succeeded to the silence of night. Suddenly, a shot was heard, followed by many others. Then shouts arose.
Hurrah! Hurrah! Forward!
An officer with 50 British soldiers appeared on the crest of the pall.
"Fire! Let none escape!"
he exclaimed. Another volley was fired straight at the group of goons which surrounded the Nana and his brother. 5 or 6 natives fell. The others, throwing themselves into the stream, disappeared among the trees.
"Nana Sahib! Nana Sahib!"
shouted the English as they penetrated the narrow ravine. All at once, one of those who had been mortally wounded rose, his hand extended. "Death to the invaders!" he cried in a hoarse voice, then fell back dead. The officer approached the body.
"Is this indeed Nana Sahib?" he asked.
"Yes, sir, it is," answered 2 of his men who had been at Cawnpore and were well acquainted with the person of the Nabob.
"After the others now!"
called out the officer, and he with all his detachment hastened off into the forest in pursuit. Scarcely had they disappeared when a dark figure glided out of the dim recesses of the pall. It was Roving Flame. The evening before, the mad woman had been the unconscious guide of the officer and his men. She had entered the valley and was mechanically bending her steps towards the pall of Tandit when she happened to pass a bivouac of soldiers who were engaged in the search for the Nana. As the strange being glided by, the tongue which was supposed to be speechless uttered a word, a name, that of the slaughterer of Cawnpore. "Nana Sahib! Nana Sahib!" she repeated, as if some unaccountable presentiment had called up the image in her mind. The officer heard and started. He instantly ordered up his men and followed in her steps, she appearing neither to see nor hear them. They reached the pall. Was this indeed the place in which the miscreant had hidden himself? The officer took the necessary measures for guarding the bed of the Nazur and waited for day. Directly Nana Sahib and his goons appeared on the scene, they were met with a volley which laid many low, and among them the chief of the Sepoy mutiny. Such was the account of the skirmish sent by telegraph to the governor of the Bombay Presidency. The telegram soon spread all over the peninsula. The papers copied it, and thus Colonel Munro read it on the 26th of May in the Allahabad Gazette. No one could any longer have doubts about the death of Nana Sahib. His identity had been proved, and as the paragraph stated, "India has now nothing further to dread from the machinations of the cruel Nabob who has cost her so much blood." The madwoman left the pall and descended the bed of the Nazur. Her hollow eyes were burning with a strange light, which was not there a short time before, and she still muttered at intervals the name of the Nana. She reached the spot where the dead bodies lay, and stopped before the one recognized by the soldiers. The horrid scowl with which he died was fixed on his features. Having lived but for vengeance, his hate still survived. The madwoman knelt down, laid her clasped hands on the body, from which the blood flowed and stained the folds of her dress, and looked long and fixedly at the face. Then she arose, and shaking her head, glided slowly away. By the time she had gone a few yards, Roving Flame had relapsed into her wonted indifference, and her lips no longer uttered the cursed name of Nana Sahib. End of chapter 16.